What's the effect of the minimum wage on employment? Well, the minimum wage should create unemployment, according to our most basic models of supply and demand. The way we represent the minimum wage on a supply and demand graph is to draw a line across it, fixed at the price of the minimum wage. Now, if the equilibrium price, which is just the price the market sets on its own, is above this line, then nothing changes. It's like if the federal government mandated a 75-cent minimum wage. It wouldn't really matter because nobody's working for less than 75 cents an hour. But if the minimum wage is set higher than the equilibrium wage, we'll see that there's more labor being supplied than there is labor being demanded. This surplus of labor is also known as unemployment. The only thing left for economists to research should be how big these increases in unemployment are. But when economists began to look for these decreases in employment, they didn't always find them. Sometimes economists reported that they found decreases in employment, and sometimes they found that increasing the minimum wage actually increased employment. So if we're going to get a good picture of what economists have actually found in the real world, we're going to have to turn to meta-analyses. Specifically, the studies I'm going to bring up are meta-regression analyses, meaning they look at previously conducted studies on the minimum wage and do some extra math to help interpret the results. I'll tell you the results of the studies first, and then we'll dive into how they came up with those results. The first study was a meta-analysis of 64 studies of minimum wage increases in the United States, and it found no statistically significant decrease in employment from raising the minimum wage, and further found a publication bias in U.S. economics literature. The second study was an analysis of 16 minimum wage studies in Great Britain. Again, it found no overall adverse employment effects. However, it did find effects in the residential home care industry. Further, the study did not find any publication bias in UK economics literature concerning the minimum wage. The way these studies were created was that researchers searched economics databases for empirical studies on minimum wage increases in the United States and Great Britain. Then they found studies that provided them with estimates of the minimum wage elasticity for employment, or in English, a specific number representing the decrease in employment resulting from a minimum wage increase. The next thing they did was to test for publication bias. Publication bias may sound like a very technical term, but it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the bias that researchers and journals exhibit when deciding what studies to publish and what studies to let collect dust. The basic idea is that studies with high degrees of error that also go against conventional wisdom are less likely to get published than studies with the same high degrees of error that don't go against the conventional wisdom. To see why this is a problem, I'll direct your attention to a funnel graph. This is a graph plotting studies of the effect of union membership on productivity. The x-axis is the effect of union membership on productivity, and the y-axis is the degree of accuracy of the study. Now you understand why it's called a funnel graph. The lower accuracy studies form a base from which the higher accuracy studies ascend and find a middle. Now, because there are theories to support both the ideas that union membership increases and decreases productivity, there's very little publication bias, as lower accuracy studies can find just about anything and it'll make sense to somebody. With that in mind, let's look at the funnel graph for the meta-analysis done in the USA. Do you see what's missing? All of the low accuracy studies that, by chance, found the minimum wage effects to increase employment are missing. This is because it seems ridiculous for economists to publish such a paper, so they don't. But this creates a problem for the rest of us, because it creates an incomplete picture of what studies economists have performed. Because at this level of error, there should be studies that, by chance, erred in favor of the minimum wage. If you only look at what was published and ignored the bias, you'd come away thinking that the empirical studies backed up the idea that the minimum wage harms employment. But if you look at the more accurate studies, you'll find that they report 0 to almost 0 negative impacts to employment. This is how the American study detected that there was a publication bias, and after they corrected for it, they found that the economics literature does not support the idea that the minimum wage increases in the United States have raised unemployment. There are quite a few theories as to why we aren't seeing the negative impacts on employment that the textbook says we should be seeing. The first possibility is that the economics textbook is just wrong in how it describes the marketplace. The model we use at the beginning of the video assumes a market that was perfectly competitive, and that in that market the buyer and seller of labor were on equal terms. There are those who look at the empirical evidence as proof that the real-life labor market is monopolistic. A monopsony is a market where there is only one buyer, as opposed to a monopoly where there's only one seller. A monopsonistic labor market would be any labor market where the employer has the upper hand and is able to set wages at below where they would be in a perfectly competitive market, just as a monopolist would be able to jack up the price of their goods. The thing about a monopolistic labor market is that it doesn't necessarily require that there only be one employer in town, but rather that the employer has a power that allows them to set wages at below the market rate. Under this view, the minimum wage is just setting the price for labor at the efficient level, so of course there wouldn't be any unemployment created. Another possible explanation is that minimum wage increases operate similar to efficiency wages. Efficiency wages are when employers decide on their own to pay a higher wage than the market rate in order to attract a better workforce, reduce turnover, and encourage their employees to be more productive. Under this view, the increased cost of higher wages is offset by the saved costs in turnover and higher worker productivity. There's also the possibility that the negative impacts minimum wage increases cause to employment only really happen over the long term. The problem with this view is that it's really difficult to test. It's near impossible to hold a variable constant over the long term, and with so many variables at play, it becomes somewhere between nearly impossible and actually impossible to determine if it was specifically a minimum wage increase that caused unemployment over the long term. Finally, there's the possibility that employers don't actually comply with the new law and cheat the system. If this is happening on a grand scale, then there's no wonder why there hasn't been an increase in unemployment. So all of this sounds pretty great, right? If unemployment isn't increased by raising the minimum wage, we could just raise it until poverty is eradicated, right? This is where we run into the fact that the studies and the meta-analysis were conducted on minimum wage increases in the US and the UK, meaning we only have data for minimum wage increases that have actually happened in those two countries. That is to say, moderate increases to the minimum wage, and you can't really predict what an $8 minimum wage increase is going to look like off of a dollar increase. And if you look at the possible reasons why we aren't seeing an increase in unemployment, they don't do away with the textbook's reason that a higher minimum wage should lead to unemployment. They just say that there are additional factors that are currently preventing increased unemployment. But if the minimum wage is raised high enough, it will overcome the monopsonistic labor market, it'll overcome the effects of efficiency wages, the effects will be felt in shorter terms, and it will become obvious who's non-compliant. We likely cannot end poverty by simply raising the minimum wage to $100 an hour. But in that case, where's the sweet spot? The point where the minimum wage is at its highest before it starts costing jobs. The Economist tackled this issue in an article titled The Logical Floor, and in it they say that as long as the minimum wage is kept below 50% of the median income of an area, then there aren't any serious negative impacts to employment. They point out that the US federal minimum wage is pretty far below this point, Britain is right about at this point with its minimum wage, and France is quite a bit beyond this point and is seeing higher unemployment as a result. For those of you who are wondering where the $15 minimum wage fits into all of this, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2017, the median weekly wages for full-time workers was about $860, with some minor changes depending on which quarter you look at for the year. If we do some back-of-the-envelope math, we find that, assuming 40 hours a week, a $15 minimum wage would be 70% of median wages. For the United States, a minimum wage of $10.75 an hour would be that 50% of median wages. However, this wage would still be far too high for some poorer parts of the country, and could be higher for richer parts of the country. I'll link to a paper in the description that does the math for each state and even takes into account cost of living. At the end of that article, The Economist advocates for state and local control over their minimum wages, handled not by politicians, but by technocrats and economists who know to set their wages to the 50% of minimum wage in order to reduce poverty without increasing unemployment. Now, I know all of this is making the minimum wage seem like a very attractive way to reduce poverty with no real downsides, as long as it's used within reason. However, there are more costs to the minimum wage than just unemployment. In upcoming videos, we'll look at automation, inflation, and the general effectiveness of the minimum wage as a way to reduce poverty.